Sign it and walk away, Elaine. You should be thanking me for leaving you that shack by the lake. That's what he said, right there in the courtroom, with his lawyer already packing up the briefcase, with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like they always do in those county buildings that smell like old carpet and stale coffee. He said it loud enough for the clerk to hear, loud enough for his brother standing by the door to let out that little laugh, that exhale through the nose that wasn't quite a chuckle, but carried every ounce of contempt a sound can carry. Richard adjusted his tie, navy blue, silk. I bought him that tie for our 20th anniversary. He wore it to court like a trophy. His lawyer, a man named Decker from that firm on Lakeshore Drive in downtown Grand Rapids, slid the final settlement page across the table. One page. 23 years of marriage reduced to a single page with a yellow tab that said, "Sign here." The paper was still warm from the printer. I remember that. I remember the warmth of it under my fingertip like it was something alive, something with a pulse. And I thought how strange it was that this flat, dead thing felt warmer than my husband had felt in years. I signed it. I signed it because my attorney, the one I could barely afford after Richard's team got the judge to deny my request for temporary support, had looked at me that morning over a cup of gas station coffee and said, "Elaine, we can fight this for another 8 months, but you'll spend $60,000 you don't have, and the outcome won't change. Not with Judge Pearson, not in this county. Take the lake house, take what you can carry, and start over." So I signed it. Richard got the home in East Grand Rapids, the one with the heated floors and the 3-car garage, and the garden I'd built with my own hands over 15 years. The roses I'd grafted myself. The stone path I'd laid one summer when he was in Chicago doing whatever he was doing in Chicago that I later learned involved a 29-year-old named Tessa. He got the brokerage accounts. He got the boat. He got the vacation fund. He got the reputation, because in Kent County, Richard Calloway was a name that opened doors, and Elaine Calloway was just the quiet woman who packed the lunches and showed up to the fundraisers in a dress that was never quite right. I got the lake house, an 1,100-square-foot cabin on the north shore of Torch Lake, 3 hours from Grand Rapids, up past Traverse City where the highway narrows and the cell signal drops and the trees close in around you like they're trying to tell you something. The cabin had been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather, Arne Korhonen, built it in 1931, with timber he milled himself after emigrating from Finland, and it sat on 47 acres of mixed hardwood and shoreline that Richard had always called, "your little fishing shack." He never went there. Not once in 23 years. He said the drive made him carsick. He said there was nothing to do. He said the property was worthless, and his appraiser agreed, putting it at $92,000 in the settlement. And my lawyer didn't push back because by then I had no money left to pay for a second opinion. $92,000. For 47 acres on Torch Lake. I didn't know what that meant yet. Not that day. That day I just signed the paper and stood up and walked out of the Kent County Courthouse on Ottawa Avenue and sat in my car, a 2011 Honda CR-V with a cracked windshield and a passenger seat covered in dog hair, from a dog that was now living in Richard's house because the settlement gave him Biscuit too. And I put my hands on the steering wheel, and I held very still. I didn't cry. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But there was something in me that had gone past crying. Some wall I'd hit during the months of depositions and accusations, and the way Richard's attorney had asked me in that calm, almost friendly voice whether I had any marketable skills. And I'd sat there unable to answer, because for 23 years, my marketable skill had been making Richard Calloway's life run smoothly while he built his commercial real estate empire and forgot my name was on nothing. So I didn't cry. I started the car. I pulled out of the parking structure on Monroe Avenue, and I drove north. 3 hours and 11 minutes later, I pulled into the gravel drive of the cabin on Torch Lake. The porch light was out. The steps needed fixing. There was a family of raccoons living under the deck, and I could hear them shuffling in the dark as I stood there with one suitcase and a box of books and the key my grandmother had given me when I was 16 years old. A brass key on a leather cord, and she'd pressed it into my palm and said something I didn't understand then. She said, "Elaine, the things that look like nothing are the things they'll come for last. And by then, you'll be ready." Grandma Signa died 4 years ago. Finnish-American, stubborn as lake ice, lived to 91. She never liked Richard. Never said so directly because that wasn't her way, but she'd watch him at family dinners with this expression, this quiet steadiness behind her glasses, like she was reading a weather pattern and didn't like what she saw coming. She was right. My name is Elaine Korhonen Calloway, though I've since dropped the Calloway. I'm 51 years old. I was a military wife before I was a real estate wife. I served 4 years in the Army as a geospatial intelligence analyst at Fort Huachuca before I met Richard. Before I traded satellite imagery for grocery lists. Before I forgot that I once had a security clearance and a mind that could read terrain like other people read novels. This is the story of how I lost everything in a courtroom in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and drove north to a lake house that everyone said was worthless. And what happened when the powerful men found out it wasn't. I need to tell you about the woman I was before Richard Calloway dismantled her. I grew up in Houghton, Michigan, way up in the Keweenaw Peninsula, where Lake Superior beats against copper-colored cliffs, and winter starts in October and doesn't apologize until May. My father was a shift supervisor at the White Pine Mine until it closed, and after that, he drove a snowplow for Houghton County until his back gave out. My mother taught 4th grade at Houghton Elementary for 31 years. They were not wealthy people. They were not connected people. But they owned things outright, and they owed nothing to anyone, and my father considered that a form of aristocracy. My grandfather, Eino Korhonen, was the one who shaped me. He'd come down from a Finnish family that settled near Chassel in the 1890s, and he still spoke fragments of Finnish when he was tired or angry, which was often. He'd been a surveyor for the county most of his life, tramping through birch forests and frozen bogs with a transit level and a chain, mapping property lines that hadn't moved in 100 years. He taught me to read topographic maps before I could read chapter books. Every Sunday, he'd unfold a USGS quad on the kitchen table and trace contour lines with his tobacco-stained finger and say, "Elaine, the land doesn't lie. People lie about the land. The land just sits there and waits." That sentence lived in me like a dormant seed for 40 years. When I was 17, I could identify soil types by feel, estimate elevation change by the way water pooled, and read a property deed with more comprehension than most adults. None of this impressed anyone at Houghton High School. I was quiet. I wore glasses that were always slightly too large for my face, and I had a way of standing very still when other people were moving that made teachers uncomfortable. One guidance counselor wrote on my file that I was passive but observant, which I think was her polite way of saying I unnerved her. I enlisted in the Army at 19 because my parents couldn't afford Michigan Tech, and I wanted to leave the peninsula without leaving the purpose my grandfather had planted in me. The Army tested me, saw whatever they saw, and sent me to Fort Huachuca in Arizona for geospatial intelligence training. The desert was the opposite of everything I knew, red and open and merciless. But the work was the same work my grandfather had done, reading terrain, understanding what the land was telling you. I spent 4 years analyzing satellite imagery and topographic data, mostly for planning purposes I wasn't allowed to discuss then and still don't discuss now. I held a TS/SCI clearance. I briefed colonels. I was 23 years old, and I was very, very good at my job. Then I met Richard at a friend's wedding in Traverse City during a leave visit. and everything I was started to dissolve like sugar in hot water. He was 12 years older, already running a mid-sized real estate development firm in Grand Rapids called Callaway Partners. Handsome in that polished West Michigan way, boat shoes and a jaw that photographed well. The kind of man who held doors open and expected you to notice. He told me I was wasting myself in the military. He said it like a compliment. He said I was too smart to be staring at maps in a windowless room. I should have heard what he was really saying, which was that my intelligence was only valuable if it served his world. I didn't hear it. I was 24, and he smelled like cedar and confidence, and I had been lonely in the desert for a long time. I left the army. I married him. I moved to Grand Rapids, into a house on Wealthy Street that he picked out without asking me, and I became Mrs. Richard Callaway. I organized his open houses. I decorated his model homes. I entertained his clients and his partners and his banker friends at dinner parties where I poured wine and laughed at jokes about property values, while my security clearance expired and my skills atrophied, and my grandfather's voice got quieter and quieter in my head. We had no children. Richard didn't want them, and by the time I realized I did, he'd already made the decision permanent through sheer delay. That absence shaped the marriage more than either of us admitted. I had nothing to pour myself into except his life, and he let me pour until I was empty. I should tell you about my left knee. I injured it during a field exercise at Huachuca, a bad twist on loose shale during a terrain assessment. The Army surgeon said it would need replacement eventually. It aches when barometric pressure drops, which in Michigan means it aches constantly from September to April. I walk with a slight favoring of my right leg that most people don't notice. Richard noticed. He called it my limp, even though it isn't one. He'd say it in front of people. "Elaine, your limp is showing." Like it was a slip in my composure, rather than a piece of my body that I'd broken in service to my country. The knee is relevant later. Everything is relevant later. That's what my grandfather understood about land and what I eventually remembered about life. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is worthless. It just sits there and waits. I met Richard Callaway at a Rotary Club dinner in Traverse City in the spring of 2011. I was 34, freshly separated from the Army, working as a GIS analyst for the county assessor's office while I figured out what civilian life was supposed to feel like. He was 41, a partner at Callaway Stroud & Fitch, a real estate development firm based in Grand Rapids with satellite offices reaching up into the northern counties. He had a full head of silver-touched hair and the kind of confidence that fills a room before the man himself walks in. He was charming. I'll give him that. Charming the way a river is fast. You don't feel the current until you're already in the middle. We married in October 2012 at a venue in Leland that he chose without asking me. I wanted the ceremony at the lake house, on the dock my grandfather had rebuilt 3 times over 40 years. Richard said it wasn't appropriate, that the property was too rough, too remote, that his partners and their wives would need accommodations, and what were we going to do? Pitch tents? He laughed when he said it. That particular laugh he had, warm on the surface, dismissive underneath, like he was helping me understand something I should have already known. So we married in Leland, and I let it go. That was the first time. The second was in 2014, about 18 months into the marriage. I had taken the exam for a senior assessor position with Leelanau County. It was a significant step. The role involved property valuation oversight for the entire county, which meant I would be the authority on what land was worth. I studied for 4 months, passed with the highest score in the candidate pool, and received the offer on a Tuesday afternoon. I drove home to tell Richard. He was in his office on a call with Dennis Stroud, his senior partner. I waited in the kitchen. When he finally came out, I told him. He said, "That's great, Elaine, really." And then he said, "But you know this means you'll be assessing properties that could conflict with my projects, right? We should think about whether this is smart." I took the job. But the way he said smart stayed with me. He didn't mean strategically intelligent, he meant obedient. He meant loyal to his interests over mine. And when I didn't comply, something shifted. It was slight, a degree or two on the thermostat. You don't notice a room getting colder until you realize you've been sitting there shivering for an hour. The third time was Thanksgiving 2016, at his mother Patricia's house in Grosse Pointe. The whole Calloway family was there, his brother Martin and Martin's wife, his sister Claire, Patricia at the head of the table like a magistrate in pearls. Richard had been drinking since noon, not drunk, never drunk, just lubricated enough to let his opinions move faster than his judgment. The conversation turned to real estate, as it always did, and someone mentioned waterfront property values going up in Benzie County. Richard said, "Well, Elaine's sitting on 32 acres of lakefront that she won't develop, so she's basically burning money for sentimental reasons." The table went quiet for half a second. Not out of discomfort, out of agreement. Patricia said, "Well, she's always been a bit attached to that place, hasn't she?" Martin said, "What's the assessed value now?" and looked at me like I was a spreadsheet. I said, "It's not for sale." Richard smiled and said, "Everything's for sale, sweetheart. It's just a question of price." I set my fork down. I picked it back up. I ate the rest of my meal in silence while they discussed the hypothetical development potential of my grandfather's land, as though I were not in the room. As though the property were already theirs in every way that mattered, and they were simply waiting for me to catch up to the obvious. I could have said something. I rehearse it sometimes. I could have told them about my grandfather carrying limestone from the shore to build that fireplace, about the morning he showed me where the eagles nested, about the clause in his will that said this land is not an asset, it is an answer. I could have told Patricia that her pearls cost less than one season of the timber rights I was deliberately not exercising, because the white pines on the North Ridge were 200 years old, and I refused to be the generation that cut them. I said nothing. The fourth time was the worst, because it was the quietest. March 2018, a Wednesday. I came home from work and found Richard in the kitchen with a man I didn't recognize. The man had a briefcase and a county plat map spread across our table. Richard introduced him as Greg Whalen, a developer from Petoskey. They were discussing my lake property. Not in theory, in specifics, parcel lines, access roads, zoning variance applications. Richard had already requested preliminary surveys. He'd contacted the township planning office using my name. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and listened to my husband explain to a stranger how the property could be subdivided into 12 lakefront lots at an estimated $350,000 per lot after infrastructure costs. Greg Whalen looked up at me and said, "Your husband says you're on board with this." I looked at Richard. He didn't flinch. He didn't look guilty. He looked like a man who had already decided something and was waiting for reality to agree with him. I said, "I'm not on board with this." Greg Whalen closed his briefcase. Richard waited until the man left, and then he said, "You're being emotional. This is a business decision. You're sitting on $4 million in potential value, and you're treating it like a graveyard." I said, "It's my land." He said, "We're married, Elaine. Nothing is just yours." That night I slept in the guest room. I lay there in the dark and listened to the furnace cycle on and off, and I thought about my grandfather's hands, how they were always rough, how they smelled like pine sap even in winter. I thought about what he told me on the dock when I was 12, the last summer before he got sick. He said, "Elaine, people will tell you what things are worth. Don't listen. Worth is what remains when everyone else leaves. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I was in the house, and I didn't cry in the house. I stayed in that guest room for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, I came downstairs, and Richard was sitting at the kitchen table, with his laptop open and 2 coffee cups set out, one for him and one for me, as if nothing had happened. He'd made mine the way I like it. A little milk, no sugar. He pushed it toward me and smiled and said, "I was thinking we could drive up to Lake Oneida this weekend. Take the boat out. Just the 2 of us." I looked at the coffee. I looked at him. And I understood something I had been refusing to understand for a very long time. The coffee wasn't an apology. It was a reset button. He wanted to skip past everything, past the appraiser in my grandfather's kitchen, past the phrase, "Nothing is just yours," past the guest room and the silence. He wanted to press the cup into my hands and watch me drink it, and know that the conversation was over, that I had absorbed it, that we could move forward, meaning forward in his direction. I picked up the cup. I drank it. And I hated myself for drinking it. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not like a door slamming or a revelation in a movie where the woman throws the coffee against the wall and walks out into the rain. Nothing like that. It was quieter and worse. It was like a hairline crack in a load-bearing wall. You can't see it from outside. The house still looks fine, but the structure knows. 2 weeks later, Richard's attorney, a man named Peter Calloway, who wore suits that cost more than my monthly salary, sent me a document. It was a post-nuptial agreement, 14 pages. Richard presented it casually over dinner at a restaurant in Tarrytown, a place with cloth napkins and candles, because he knew I wouldn't raise my voice in a restaurant. He said his financial advisor recommended it. He said it was standard for couples in their income bracket. He said it protected both of us. I read it that night at the kitchen table after he went to bed. The language was dense, but the meaning was simple. The lake house, the 47 acres, the waterfront, all classified as marital property subject to equitable distribution. My salary, my pension, my years at Buchanan, listed as income streams to be factored into any future settlement. His consulting firm, his equity stakes, his partnership in the development group, sheltered behind 3 LLCs and a trust I'd never heard of. I sat there for a long time. The kitchen was dark except for the light over the stove. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear a dog barking somewhere down the street. And I heard my grandfather's voice, not like a hallucination, not like some spiritual visitation, just the memory of it, clear and plain. Worth is what remains when everyone else leaves. I did not sign the postnuptial agreement. I told Richard the next morning. I said I wasn't comfortable with it. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when a subordinate said something stupid in a meeting, and he said, "Okay, we can talk about it later." But his eyes changed. There was a calculation happening behind them that I recognized because I'd seen it in boardrooms, in negotiations, in the face of every person who realizes that the thing they assumed was settled is not settled. He didn't bring it up again for 6 weeks, and then one evening he came home and told me he'd filed for divorce. He said it simply. He said, "I think we've been growing apart for a long time, Elaine. I think we both know this." He said he wanted it to be amicable. He said he hoped we could handle it like adults. I was standing at the sink washing a colander of blueberries. I remember the water running over my hands and the blueberries rolling and the late May light coming through the window. I remember the smell of the basil plant on the sill. I remember all of this because the body records what the mind tries to skip past. I turned off the water. I set the colander down. I said, "Okay." That was it. That was the moment. Not rage, not tears, not a speech. just the quiet click of something locking into place. I had spent 22 years believing that patience was the same thing as wisdom, that absorbing someone's ambition was the same as partnership, that love meant letting someone else define the terms and trusting that they wouldn't use that power against you. Standing at that sink with blueberry stains on my fingers, I stopped believing all of it at once. It was not dramatic. It was not even painful. Not yet. The pain came later, in the car, alone, at 11 at night in the parking lot of a CVS on Route 9, where I sat with the engine running and cried so hard I couldn't breathe. But in the kitchen, in front of Richard, I was still. I was granite. He wanted amicable. He wanted adults. I looked at him and I said, "I'll find my own attorney." He blinked. I think he expected me to ask if we could try counseling. I think he expected me to negotiate. Instead, I dried my hands on the kitchen towel, walked past him, went upstairs, and closed the bedroom door. I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought about the lake. I thought about the dock, the way the wood goes silver in the weather. I thought about what was mine and what I was willing to lose, and what I would protect no matter what it cost me. The crack in the wall had reached the foundation. The house was coming down. And for the first time in 22 years, I was the one who understood the blueprints. The next morning I called Helen Vasquez. Not a name Richard would have expected. He had his attorney already, of course, Brent Massey, from the firm that handled Ridgefield's commercial real estate, country club connections, golf foursomes. Richard had probably been planning this for months, maybe longer. The way certain financial statements had shifted, the way he'd restructured his consulting LLC the previous spring, moving income into accounts that somehow never appeared on our joint filings. I hadn't understood it at the time. Now, I understood it perfectly. Helen Vasquez worked out of a small office on Griswold Street in downtown Hartford, second floor above a Thai restaurant. The carpet was industrial gray and her desk was piled with folders, and she had reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and she didn't smile when she shook my hand. She listened. I talked for 40 minutes. She took notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so small it looked like code. When I finished, she put her pen down and she said, "How much do you know about what he earns?" I said, "I know enough." She said, "Tell me about the lake house." So I told her. I told her about Grandma Ellie buying that property in 1961 for $12,000. I told her about the deed that passed to my mother and then to me, held in trust, never commingled with marital assets. I told her about the summers there, the winters, the years of property tax I paid from my own teaching account, never from the joint. I told her about the dock and the pines and the 300 feet of shoreline on Bantam Lake, and the fact that Richard had always called it the shack. Always with that little smile. "A dump," he'd say. "Why do you keep paying taxes on a dump?" Helen looked at me over the legal pad and she said, "He's going to come for it." "I know," I said. She said, "They always come for the thing they told you was worthless. That's when they show you what they really think it's worth." I spent the next 4 months preparing. Not loudly, not obviously. I taught my classes at Wamogo Regional. I graded papers. I coached the girls' cross-country team through the fall season. I attended parent-teacher conferences and department meetings, and I smiled, and I was professional. And nobody at school knew that my marriage was disintegrating, because I did not give them that. That was mine to carry. But at night, after the house was quiet, after Richard had gone to whatever room he was sleeping in by then, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, and I organized 22 years of financial life. Every bank statement, every tax return, every property record. I requested copies of documents from the Litchfield Town Clerk's office. I found Grandma Ellie's original purchase agreement in a cedar box in the attic of the lake house, the paper so old it felt like cloth. I photographed every page. I created a digital archive, and I backed it up twice. Once on a flash drive I kept in my classroom desk drawer, and once on a cloud account Richard didn't know existed. Helen had told me to document everything. So I documented everything. I found the records showing Richard's LLC had received $147,000 the year before that never appeared on our household accounting. I found a second bank account at Webster Bank that my name had never been on. I found emails, printed from a shared home computer years ago and forgotten in a drawer, in which Richard discussed with Brent Massey the possibility of reclassifying his consulting income to reduce what he called exposure. Exposure. To me, his wife of 22 years was exposure. I did not confront him. I did not leave the papers on the counter. I did not cry in the shower, though I wanted to, some nights, when I realized how long it had been going on. Instead, I made copies. I labeled the copies. I put the copies in a file at Helen's office. And I kept teaching. I kept coaching. I kept showing up. Richard was magnanimous during this time. He told friends we were separating amicably. He told his mother it was mutual. He offered me the Subaru and the furniture, as though he were being generous, as though I should be grateful for the couch I'd picked out myself and the car I'd been driving for 9 years. He mentioned, casually, that the lake property should probably be sold and the proceeds split. "Market's been good up there," he said one evening over takeout. "Could probably get $300, $350 for the land alone. We could both walk away clean." I looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who had called the lake house a dump for 2 decades, who refused to spend Thanksgiving there because the heating was unreliable, who never once helped me reshingle the roof or winterize the pipes or sand the dock boards in April. Now he wanted to walk away clean with half of it. I said, "We can discuss all of that through our attorneys." He didn't like that. I saw his jaw tighten. He wanted this easy. He wanted me compliant. He wanted the version of me who nodded and accommodated and kept the peace. He had built 22 years of marriage on that version, and that version was gone. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday in late January at a conference room in downtown Burlington. Mark's attorney had requested it, which should have told me everything. People request mediation when they think they can charm their way through a room. Mark had always been good in rooms. I drove up from the lake house that morning. The roads were icy past Stowe, and I took them slowly. I had my documents in a leather portfolio my grandmother had given me when I graduated from UVM. It smelled like her closet, like cedar and old lavender sachets. Inside were the original deed transfer from my grandfather to me, dated 1994. The property tax records I had paid alone for 23 years. The maintenance logs I had kept in a green spiral notebook. Every replaced window, every new water heater, every cord of firewood purchased and stacked with my own hands. The appraisal I had quietly commissioned in November, which valued the property and structures at $412,000. And the letter from the Chittenden County Recorder confirming that the property had never been converted to joint ownership. Mark didn't know about any of it. We arrived separately. I parked in the garage on Cherry Street and walked 2 blocks in the cold. The conference room was on the 3rd floor of a brick building near the courthouse. Glass table, bad coffee, a mediator named Patricia Soule who looked like she had seen 1,000 marriages come apart in rooms exactly like this one and was no longer moved by any of it. Mark was already seated with his attorney, a man named Greg Duval from a firm in Montpelier. They had papers spread out. Mark wore the blue sport coat he always wore when he wanted to seem reasonable. He smiled at me when I walked in. That careful smile. The one that said, "Let's be adults about this." My attorney, Claire Brousseau, sat beside me and said nothing for the first 10 minutes. She let Greg talk. She let Mark talk. She let them lay out their position, which was this. The marital estate should be divided equitably, and the Lake Champlain property, while technically in my name, had functioned as a shared family asset for the duration of the marriage. Mark had contributed to its upkeep. Mark had emotional ties to it. Mark's children had memories there. Therefore, Mark was entitled to half of its fair market value, which his appraiser had estimated at $310,000. I listened to all of it. I watched Mark nod along as his attorney spoke, that earnest expression he wore so well. I thought about the time the septic system failed in 2011, and I spent 4 days in mud dealing with the excavation crew while he stayed in Williston because he had a departmental meeting he couldn't miss. I thought about his mother, saying the house smelled like mildew at Christmas dinner in 2015. I thought about every single year I wrote the property tax check from my own account, not our joint account, because Mark said it was my inheritance and I should handle it. Patricia Soule turned to us. She asked if we had a response. Claire opened the portfolio. She did it slowly. She placed the deed on the table first, then the tax records, then the maintenance logs, then the appraisal, then the recorder's letter. She arranged them in a line, like cards in a hand she had been holding for a very long time. She said, "The property was transferred to my client by her grandfather through a direct family deed in 1994, 3 years before the marriage. It has never been retitled. Every property tax payment for 23 years was made from my client's sole account. Every repair, every improvement, every insurance premium was paid by my client alone. Mr. Elliston made no financial contribution to this property at any point during the marriage. Under Vermont statute, separate property remains separate unless commingled with marital assets. This property was never commingled. It is not part of the marital estate." The room went very quiet. I watched Mark's face. It didn't change all at once. It changed in stages. First, the slight frown, the one that meant he was calculating. Then the shift in his posture, leaning forward, hands flat on the glass. Then the color leaving his cheeks as Greg Duvall picked up the tax records and flipped through them. Page after page of checks written from my account only, my signature only, my name only. Greg asked for a recess. Patricia granted it. They stepped into the hallway for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall, a plain white institutional clock with a red second hand that moved in tiny jerks. When they came back, Mark's careful smile was gone. He looked at me directly for the first time all morning. Not at Claire, not at the documents, at me. He said, "You planned this." I said, "I kept records, there's a difference." He said, "You let me think we'd split it." "You let me believe that for months." I said, "You let yourself believe it. I never promised you that house. I never promised you anything my grandfather gave me. You just assumed it was yours because everything always was." Patricia Soule wrote something on her pad. Greg Duvall closed his folder. Claire did not move. She had told me this would happen. She had told me he would make it about betrayal instead of facts, because the facts were not on his side and he knew it. Mark sat back in his chair. He picked up his water glass and held it without drinking, just held it in front of him like he had forgotten what it was for. Then he set it down carefully and said, "That house is a shack on a lake. It's not worth destroying everything over." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because after 22 years, he still didn't understand. It was never about the money. It was never even about the house. It was about the fact that my grandfather built something with his hands and left it to me because he trusted me to keep it. And keeping it meant not giving it away to someone who never once said thank you for it. The mediation ended 40 minutes ahead of schedule. Mark and Greg left first. I stayed in the conference room with Claire, looking out the window at the lake in the distance, gray and frozen under a white sky. Claire put her hand on my shoulder for 1 second and then removed it. She said, "That went exactly how we prepared for." I said, "I know, and I still feel sick." We drove back to the lake house in silence. Claire had another case in Syracuse the next morning, so she dropped me at the end of the gravel road and pulled away before I even reached the porch. The house was cold. I had turned the heat down before leaving for the mediation because the propane bill in January had been $412, and I was watching every penny. I turned the thermostat up to 62, put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table in my coat, waiting for the water to boil. My phone buzzed 11 times in the first hour. I know because I counted. I did not look at any of the messages until the next morning. The first was from Mark. It said, "You need to reconsider. This is going to get ugly for everyone, including you." The second was from Greg. It said, "Call me when you calm down." The third through seventh were from my mother. They ranged from confused to furious. The eighth was from my cousin Deborah, who I had not spoken to in 3 years. She wrote, "I heard what happened. I just want you to know, I think you did the right thing." The ninth was from a number I did not recognize. It turned out to be a reporter from the Watertown Daily Times who had been covering the rezoning dispute and somehow learned about the mediation. The 10th was from my sister-in-law Karen, who wrote only a single line. She said, "Mark is bested himself. I hope you're happy." The 11th was from Claire. It said, "The judge's written decision will be filed by Friday. Do not speak to anyone until then." I did not speak to anyone until then. The decision came on Thursday, 1 day early. Judge Whitmore ruled that the original deed filed by my grandfather in 1974 was unambiguous. The lake house and the 11 acres surrounding it were mine, free and clear, and had been since the day he died. The transfer clause that Mark's attorney had tried to invoke, the one buried in a codicil that Mark claimed gave him right of first refusal, was ruled invalid on the grounds that it had been drafted after my grandfather's diagnosis, when his cognitive capacity was already in question. Claire had spent 4 months gathering medical records from the VA hospital in Canandaigua to prove that. 4 months of phone calls and faxes and certified letters. She never once complained about the work. She only said, once, that she wished she had met my grandfather because he sounded like the kind of man who kept his word. The decision also addressed the rezoning application filed by Lakeview Capital Partners. Judge Whitmore noted that since the property was not, and had never been under Mark's legal authority to negotiate, the preliminary agreement he had signed with Lakeview was void. The development company had no standing. The proposed boutique resort and marina would not be built on my grandfather's land. I read the decision 3 times sitting in the same chair where Pop used to read the morning paper. The light was coming through the east window, the way it always does in winter, low and gold and brief. By the time I finished the 3rd reading, the light was gone. Mark called that evening. I answered because I thought it might be the last time we would ever speak, and I wanted to hear what he would say. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know, Dad would have wanted us to handle this differently." I said, "Dad wanted a lot of things. That does not mean he was right about all of them." He hung up. My mother called the next morning. She was crying. She said I had torn the family apart. She said my grandfather would be ashamed. I held the phone away from my ear for a moment and looked at the framed photograph on the mantel. The one of Pop and me standing on the dock the summer I was 9. Both of us holding smallmouth bass. Both of us squinting into the sun. I brought the phone back and said, "Mom, he left it to me." She said, "He left it to the family." I said, "No, he left it to me." There is a legal difference and there is also a personal one, and I am done pretending otherwise. She did not call again for 6 weeks. Greg tried a different approach. He sent a letter through his attorney, not to Claire, but directly to my home address, offering to purchase the property for $350,000. The letter described this as a generous offer, reflecting current market conditions. Claire later told me the assessed value, especially with the lakefront footage and the timber rights on the back acreage, was closer to $1.2 million. She said Greg knew that. She said the low offer was not a negotiation. It was a test to see if I was tired enough to take it. I was tired. I will not pretend I was not. The mediation had cost me $8,000. The legal fees over the previous 14 months totaled just over $31,000. I had taken out a second mortgage on my apartment in Watertown to pay for it. I was sleeping 5 hours a night and eating mostly soup and toast because grocery shopping felt like an errand that belonged to someone with a less complicated life. But I was not $350,000 tired. I wrote back to Greg's attorney myself, without telling Claire, which she later said was inadvisable but understandable. I wrote one line. I said, "The property is not for sale. Please do not contact me at this address again." 2 weeks later, Deborah drove up from Binghamton. She brought a casserole and a bottle of wine, and we sat on the porch in our coats because the house was still cold and the porch had better light. She told me that the family had been talking. She said most of them thought I was being selfish. She said a few of them, the quiet ones, thought I was being brave. She said she was not sure which word was right, but she knew one thing. She said, "Pop gave it to you because you were the only one who ever loved the place for what it was, instead of what it could become." I poured more wine and said nothing for a while. The lake was starting to thaw at the edges. You could hear it, a faint cracking sound, like someone shifting in a wooden chair. Deborah asked if I was going to be okay. I said I did not know yet. She nodded like that was the only honest answer. The one person I did not expect to hear from was Mark's daughter, my niece, Sophie. She was 23 and had just finished her degree at SUNY Oswego. She sent me a handwritten letter, not a text, a letter, on lined paper, in an envelope with a stamp. She wrote that she remembered coming to the lake house when she was small. She remembered the dock and the loons calling at dusk, and the way the kitchen smelled like coffee and pine. She wrote that she did not understand all the legal details, but she understood that I had fought to keep something that mattered. She wrote, "Aunt Ellen, I think that matters more than people are saying right now." I put the letter in the drawer of the nightstand next to the bed in the room where I sleep when I stay at the lake house. The same nightstand that was there when Pop was alive. The same drawer where he kept his reading glasses and a small flashlight and a folded prayer card from my grandmother's funeral. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time after I put the letter away. The house was quiet the way it only gets in late October, when the summer people have gone and the seasonal renters have packed up and the lake belongs to whoever is stubborn enough to stay. I could hear the dock creaking. I could hear a single bird somewhere in the spruce trees, something small, a chickadee maybe, making its 2-note call over and over like it was trying to remind itself of something. Pop used to say that the hardest part of doing the right thing is not doing it. The hardest part is sitting with it afterward and wondering if you did it for the right reasons. I have thought about that a lot. I would be lying if I told you I came through all of this feeling clean. I would be lying if I said I never enjoyed watching Gary Beckford's face when the judge read the injunction. I would be lying if I said I did not feel a small, hot satisfaction when I learned that Meridian stock dipped after the local news ran the story about the contamination data. I am human. I felt those things. I let myself feel them for about a day each time, and then I put them down, because carrying satisfaction around like a trophy is just another way of letting other people's behavior define your life. But I will tell you what I did not feel. I did not feel vindicated. That is the word people kept using. My cousin Rachel called and said, "You must feel so vindicated." A woman at the hardware store in Kellam who recognized me from the newspaper said it must be so vindicating to see those men get what they deserved. Even Frank Ellsworth, who is not a man given to dramatic language, said once on the phone that the outcome was a vindication of everything my grandfather stood for. I understand why people use that word. It is a clean word. It suggests a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, and at the end, justice arrives like a bus pulling into the station right on schedule. But that is not how it felt from inside. From inside, it felt like I had spent 2 years holding my breath underwater, and when I finally came up, the air was not sweet. It was just air. I was just breathing. The water was still there. It had not gone anywhere. Pop's phrase keeps coming back to me now, different than it used to. When I was young and he said, "The land does not belong to you, you belong to the land." I thought it was a gentle thing, a kind of poetry, the sort of thing old men say on porches while the sun goes down. I thought it meant, love the place where you are, be grateful, tend what you have. I do not think that is what he meant anymore. I think he meant it as a warning. I think he meant that belonging to the land is not comfortable, it is not peaceful. It means the land makes demands of you, and you do not get to choose when those demands come or what they cost. It means that when someone tries to poison the water, or strip the trees, or turn the shore into a parking lot for a hotel that will employ people at minimum wage for 6 months a year, you do not get to look away. You do not get to say, "That is not my problem," because you belong to it. You are bound. I think Pop knew that belonging is heavier than owning. I think he chose it anyway. I think that is why he never sold, even when selling would have been easy, even when the taxes went up and the roof needed work, and everyone around him was cashing out and moving to condominiums in Laconia with heat that actually worked. He was not holding on to a house. He was honoring an obligation that nobody had asked him to sign, but that he had signed anyway, somewhere inside himself, a long time ago. I think I understand that now, in a way I could not have understood it before the lawsuit, before the depositions, before Gary Beckford sat across from me and told me I was a sentimental woman clinging to a rotting dock. Maybe I was. Maybe I am. But I also know what is in the water. I know what they would have put in the soil. I know what the land asked of me, and I know that I answered. I do not know if I answered for the right reasons every single time. Some days I think I kept fighting partly because I was angry, partly because I was stubborn, partly because Helen Wheeler's voice in that courtroom made something close inside me that I wanted to pry back open. Some days I think I kept fighting because I could not stand the idea of those men being right about me. And I have had to sit with the possibility that spite and principle can live in the same body at the same time, and you do not always get to know which one is steering. Pop would have said that is fine. Pop would have said the land does not care why you protect it, it only cares that you do. I choose to believe that. I have to. There is a bench on the east side of the lake that I built the autumn after the appeals court ruling became final. I used cedar from a tree that had fallen during a storm the previous winter, one of the old ones near the water that had been leaning for years before it finally gave up its grip on the bank. I stripped the bark myself and sanded the seat until it was smooth enough that you could run your hand along it without catching a splinter. It is not a beautiful bench. It is a little uneven. One leg sits on a flat rock I wedged into the mud because the ground slopes there and I could not get it level any other way. But it faces the water at the exact angle where you can watch the light change in the evening. And that is what I built it for. I sit there most nights now. Not every night. Some nights I am too tired, or the mosquitoes are too thick, or I simply do not feel like walking down there. But most nights I do. And I bring coffee if it is cool, and water if it is warm. And I sit and I watch the lake go dark by degrees. First, the far tree line loses its edges. Then the water stops reflecting and starts absorbing. Then the sky holds the last of the color for a few minutes longer than you think it will. And then that goes too. And it is just me and the sound of frogs and the smell of mud and pine and whatever the lake itself smells like, which is something I have never been able to name, but which I would recognize anywhere on Earth. I think about Pop out there. Not in a sad way anymore. In the way you think about someone whose voice you can still hear if you sit still long enough. I think about him teaching me to check the soil with my hands, pressing it between my fingers, and telling me that dirt will always tell you the truth if you know how to listen. I think about him sitting in his own chair on this same bank 50 years ago, watching this same water, maybe having this same feeling that the world is enormous and complicated, and full of people who want things from you, but that right here, right now, in this specific chair, on this specific piece of ground, none of that can reach you. He used to say that the land does not remember what you lost. It only remembers what you gave. I did not understand that when I was young. I thought it was one of his sayings that sounded wise but did not actually mean anything specific. I understand it now. I understand it because I lost a marriage and a house in town, and most of my savings and several years of peace, and a version of myself that trusted people more easily than I do now. The land does not hold any of that. The land holds the fence I repaired, and the brush I cleared, and the erosion I stopped along the north bank, and the trees I planted where the old ones came down. That is what stays. The rest of it, the court dates, the certified letters, the nights I sat in my truck in the courthouse parking lot with my hands shaking, all of that belongs to me, and it lives in my body, and I carry it. But the land does not carry it. The land just grows. I got a letter from Marcus Webb about 4 months ago. Not from his attorneys, from him. It was short. He said he had heard I was doing well, and he wanted me to know there were no hard feelings on his end. I read it twice, and then I put it in the drawer where I keep the property records, and I did not respond. I do not owe him a response. I do not owe him the effort it would take to explain why that letter made me feel something I still cannot name. Something between pity and disgust, and a strange, exhausted kind of wonder that a man can try to take your home and then write you a note saying no hard feelings, as if he had merely bumped your shopping cart in a grocery aisle. I suppose that is what power does to your sense of proportion. It makes everything you do to other people feel small. I do not think about Helen Wheeler much. I heard she left the firm. I heard she moved to Raleigh. That is all I know and all I need to know. I think about Judge Alderman sometimes. I think about the way she read the ruling, steady and clear, not rushing, making sure every word landed. I think about how she looked at me once, just briefly, when it was over. It was not a smile. It was something quieter. Recognition, maybe. An acknowledgement that something had been done correctly in a room where things had previously been done wrong. I carry that look with me, too. The lake is still here. I am still here. The deed is in my name, and the taxes are paid, and the fence line is clean, and the water is clear and cold, and it tastes the way it has always tasted, like stone and time, and something deeper than either. If you are hearing this and you are in the middle of your own fight, I am not going to tell you it gets easier. I am not going to tell you the system works, because sometimes it does not, and you and I both know that. What I will tell you is this: know what you are holding. Know its real value, not the number someone else puts on it, but what it actually is and what it actually means. And if you know that, if you know it all the way down in the part of you that does not negotiate, then you will find a way to keep holding it, even when your hands are tired, even when everyone in the room is telling you to let go. The land does not remember what you lost, it only remembers what you gave. So give it something worth remembering.